Hello again. In Module 4, we complete our look at the rules for writing requirements. In particular, we focus on when we should and should not be precise, how to use units, ranges and tolerances, and some final things to avoid, such as cross-references including pronouns and the use of not in forming negative requirements. In the last presentation, we addressed more of the rules we need to follow in order to develop good requirement statements. In this presentation, we complete the list of things to avoid when writing text-based requirements. While we're looking for precision in requirement statements, we must also be careful to avoid over-specifying by being too precise or by using absolute values inappropriately. For example, the system shall provide 100% availability is unacceptable because it is impossible to achieve 100% availability. Similarly, the pump system shall maintain a flow rate of 100 litres per second is unachievable because a pump cannot be manufactured with such accuracy. Now, since it's also impossible to manufacture a measuring system with such accuracy, the requirement also can't be verified. So we have to give some latitude, such as an absolute or a percentage. So we might say, the pump system shall maintain a flow rate of 100 plus or minus 2 litres per second, or plus or minus 2% litres per second. Other examples of inappropriate narrowness relate to being unnecessarily prescriptive. So for example, if we say, the system shall allow users to search for a catalogued item by ISBN, we've become too prescriptive. An ISBN relates to a book. A library system comprises other catalogue items such as journals and videos, each of which have a different cataloguing number. There are some cases, however, when it's necessary to be explicit about some aspect of the system. That's particularly true if it's necessary that the system meets some existing constraint, in which case the precise nature of that constraint should be stated. So for example, the business owners might want a system to be able to use the same operating system as any other system, so they might actually say the system shall utilise and then name the operating system explicitly. Or, if they want it written in the language that their software developers can maintain, they might say shall be written in C++, for example, as a very specific statement. Now, further to our desire to be explicit, all numbers used in requirements should have units explicitly stated. So, for example, the refrigerator shall maintain an internal temperature of less than or equal to 4 degrees is unacceptable because the units aren't specified. It could be Celsius, Fahrenheit, or perhaps Kelvin. And so we would need to say the refrigerator shall maintain an internal temperature of less than or equal to 4 degrees Celsius. Now, when we describe ranges, there are a few rules. If the maximum value is not included in the range, then we would write shall be less than, or we could use the less than 3, for example, mathematical symbol. If the maximum value is included in the range, then we shall say less than or equal to. If the minimum value is not included, we say greater than. If it is included, we say greater than or equal to. And of course, if both the maximum and minimum values are not included, then we would say shall be greater than and less than. If the maximum and minimum values are both included in the range, then we would say shall be greater than or equal to and less than or equal to. When the tolerance is the same on either side of the value, then we might say something like 10 plus or minus 2. When the tolerances are unequal, we would say 10 plus 2 or minus 3, for example. In terms of bounded quantities, the presence of not in a requirement implies not ever or never, which is impossible to verify unless we have infinite time. So we need to rewrite the requirement to avoid the use of not, and that results normally in a clearer requirement which is more verifiable. So for example, if we say the system shall not allow unauthorized access, that statement is unacceptable because there's no way of verifying that the system will never allow access to an unauthorized user, made worse of course by the double negative. So we would rewrite it to say the system shall provide access only to authorized users. Similarly, we can't say the system shall not fail because verification of the requirement would require infinite time. And so we would say the system shall have an availability of greater than or equal to 95%, for example. Another source of ambiguity results when the writer assumes incorrectly that the reader has access to additional information. For example, in the two requirements, the user interface shall display the location of the lead vehicle, And then the second requirement, the user interface shall display the identity of the same vehicle, the second requirement statement relies on the context provided by the first, through cross-reference by use of the word same. If the two statements are separated, the second statement now doesn't make any sense. That was always a possibility when the two requirements were typed one under the other in a text-based specification. In most modern requirements management systems, the requirements are actually held in a database and are often extracted independently, so it's even worse. There are other cross-referencing words which should be avoided, words such as below, above, aforementioned, aforesaid, following, herein, hereafter, and preceding. In terms of cross-referencing, we should also avoid the use of pronouns. Pronouns stand for nouns. So examples of pronouns include it, this, that, they, she, he, their, them. So a pronoun is effectively therefore a cross-reference and should be avoided. Although the set of requirements is therefore more stilted to read than General English would, where we use pronouns to avoid having to repeat the noun, each statement does now stand alone and the noun has to be repeated to avoid the ambiguity. This is especially true when requirements are stored in the requirements database. Well, that pretty well completes our list of things to avoid, long as it might be. Before we finish, however, there are a few guidelines worth mentioning that also assist in well-written requirements. First, it's often much easier to describe by illustration many aspects of a system, interfaces for example, rather than in a large number of statements. A picture is often worth 1,000 words. As well as saving space, diagrams are also very useful in avoiding ambiguity and confusion, particularly when the requirements are multidimensional and interdependent. One of the difficulties with the use of diagrams in figures is that additional care must be taken with the verification statements. While it might be simpler to write one requirement, say in accordance with Table 1, it's not generally possible to write a single verification statement in the same way. And so verification statements tend to have to be written then towards rows of tables or towards cells in tables. Now, the second general rule is that if we follow the rules of writing good requirements, the requirement set, as you've seen, is invariably very difficult to read because we've not allowed any of the techniques that lead to good English prose. We've short sentences, no pronouns, no synonyms, and a very narrow set of glossary-defined terms. So the set is actually quite difficult to read. It's very difficult to infer from the set some view of what the actual system looks like. To assist the reader in understanding the requirement set, it's often useful to introduce, therefore, logical groups of requirements with informative statements that illustrate to the reader the intent of that section of the specification. Now, these sections are not normally considered normative, that is, legally binding, but they do greatly assist in removing potential ambiguity because they communicate the customer's intent and therefore provide a basis for the fitness of purpose argument that might inform a claim against common law warranty. And finally, as a general rule, there are a number of mechanisms that could be used to refer to content in other documents, other specifications, other standards, and so on. We could say in accordance with, or as specified in, as set out in, and so on. It doesn't really matter which one is chosen, although in accordance with is probably the most useful. Whichever you do choose, however, it's essential that only one is used throughout the requirements set. Well, that completes our brief introduction to the rules for writing good text-based requirements. As I mentioned at the outset, the Incosi Guide for Writing Requirements provides some 40 rules for writing good textual requirements, and it's an excellent source if you'd like more detail on any of the aspects we've covered here. Well, so that brings us to the end of the final module. Hopefully you now know a little bit more about writing requirements and why it's so important to get the requirements right before we go any further. Particularly if the requirements are going to form the basis of a formal contract. Again, please go back through the presentation until you're comfortable. You can then confirm that you've absorbed the material by completing the module quiz. Now that also completes all the presentations for the course. I suggest that you use the remaining time in this week and next week preparing for and completing the course test. Remember, the module quiz questions are great preparation for the test because the test questions come from the same set of questions as the quiz, or at least the questions are very similar in their nature and depth.